talk a little bit about transhumanism, strangely enough, and how are we supposed to live in this bizarre age in which we find ourselves. So I thought to start, I would read a little bit of the introduction to this book, which I published, The Heavenly Country, which I published. It's an anthology of primary sources, poetry, and critical essays on sociology, which I published in 2016. Jeez, is that long ago? Um, that's almost 9 years ago I published this book. So listen up. So here's from the introduction. We live in an age of untrammeled superstition, the hope that science will save us from ourselves and bless us with prosperity, and even that it will allow us to overcome death. This is an age of the totalization of the technological and the technocratic, an age of the unreal, the artificial, the illusory, of the simulacra. Indeed, our moment anticipates the absolute technological colonization of the human person, a grotesque and horrifying apotheosis of all that is implied by the notion of evolution. This teleological unfolding, which will without question be attended by violence implicit in such a blind, if altogether unconscious, faith in the survival of the fittest, thus superstition. Now, like I said, I wrote that 9 years ago, almost 10. And the weird thing is, so when I wrote this, when this was published before COVID, it's like how we remember things now. It's like the new ADBC. It's before COVID and after COVID because the world's a different place, right? Um, Even at that time, very few people were talking about transhumanism or even thinking about it. Um, I first published on transhumanism in, I think it was 2005, so 20 years ago. Might have been even earlier, in a really obscure journal called, I can't remember the name of the journal. What's it called? It's I can't remember. I cannot remember the name. It's so obscure. I don't remember the name. But it was actually pretty well received, and it was actually reprinted in um, a German edition of a book on roboethics, and I ended up in there. I don't know how. Well, the reason being is because I wrote the title. The title of the article is "Meditations on Blade Runner." That's actually, I think it's for the Journal of Interdisciplinary Studies. That's what it was called. And if you want to read it, actually, you can. If you don't have access to a library, and I don't know if it's still on those databases because the databases in college and university libraries has become so weird, flooded with all this subpar stuff from obscure like Turkey and other places. Not that it's not decent, but it's not relevant usually to American students. Um, but anyway, what I wrote this article about was it's called "Meditations on Blade Runner." What to sneeze? Must be. And Blade Runner, of course, the classic sci-fi film from 1982, I think it was, and the question of what it is to be human, which is the one of the fundamental uh, philosophical questions. What does it mean to be human? And in Blade Runner, if you know the movie, the the marketing slogan for the replicants or the androids is more human than human. And which so that I was really thinking about that. And what happened, when I started teaching college 25 years ago. The book we had, I was teaching a composition course. In the book, there was a chapter from Philip K. Dick's "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep," which is the novel upon which Blade Runner is based. And both Philip K. Dick, if you know him, he's an interesting thinker. and he's really caught up with the question of identity. How do we know what we see is real and that what we are real? And so it's living in a simulacra. And an interesting thing in Duran Duran's Dream of Electric Sheep, there's an interesting couple of chapters where there's an alternative police force. So there's, if you know Blade Runner, like Deckard's a cop, he's looking for replicants. But in the book, there's like the human police force, but there's also this kind of shadow police force, which is made of all replicants, and they don't even know it, or androids in the book. And the curious thing with that is that that's kind of what we have, where we find ourselves now in culture. We have the media is a great example. You have the mainstream media where you get one kind of set of propositions, and then you have kind of the shadow media or the alternative media or independent journalists or whatever you want to call them, right? Which give you a different take on it. But of course, it's not exactly like in Blade Runner, actually in Duane Droid's Dream of Electric Sheep, because in there, the mainstream is still human. And and I got some questions about whether our mainstream is still human. And you probably saw a report that came out this week of 60 Minutes tampering or editing, creative editing the interview they did with Kamala Harris to make her sound more coherent, which is really unprecedented, I think, in mainstream. Well, put it this way. It's probably not unprecedented in mainstream journalism, but the fact that we caught it is unprecedented. So there we are. So I think about these questions a lot, about what it is to be human, what it is to be real. How do we know what we see is true? How do we know it's not all just fabricated, or we're not living in the Matrix? But there's a precedent for this. I don't know if I mentioned it before, but when in the early 2000s, I was actually in the early 90s, mid 90s. My wife and I entered the Romanian Byzantine Catholic Church. Well, I was actually already Catholic, so I didn't have to do anything. But my wife did, and our kids were baptized. Those we had at the time. And what was interesting about that experience is this is right after the fall of communism, and a lot of Romanian nationals were coming over to the United States and trying to, make a life for themselves here. And there were a lot of Romanians at our church. And I remember talking to this one woman who she had been a doctor in Romania, but she had to go through all the examinations and get recertified in the States. And I said, well, what was it like when communism fell? And she said, oh, we were, if you would go to cafes or any place, you would just see people reading the newspaper, because we had no idea what had been going on in the rest of the world while we were under communism, because they were fed a certain diet, let's say, of media, and that's all they learned about. And what we see happening in the world now is actually we see the maneuvering by governments and non-governmental agencies and other places to, enforce censorship on, say, it's X, for instance, which that when I hear about that stuff, I think about it, my friend from Romania, and they were in this information bubble that was meant to engineer consent, to engineer the populace. And I think, we're in that position right now. And in fact, some of you might not know, but I co-host the Regeneration podcast with my friend Mike Sauter. We talked to a guy from Montreal the other day, and Canada is really close to where I live. I could drive there in less than an hour. And he told us that the information that they're getting in Canada through social media is also um, greatly reduced compared to what we get in the United States, which is it's kind of disturbing, right? And so thinking about this, life under communism, there's a couple of really good books which you might want to check out at some time. One is The Captive Mind by Czeslaw Milosz. I think is probably one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. He was Polish, and in The Captive Mind, which is not poetry, he tells the story of how people he knew, friends of his, gradually, piece by piece, capitulated to the communist superego, we could call it, right? And how sad it was. I mean, he himself for a while as a diplomat for the Polish communist government, but then, and he says in the introduction, he just couldn't leave his country. He's a poet. He can't leave his language. But eventually he did, and he lived the last 60 years. He lived to be an old man, 60 years or more of his life in the West, and lived in California. And I think he taught at the University of Berkeley for a long time. And so in this book, he just kind of traces the taxonomy of his friends who caved, right? And I think this is important for us to think about because, and I see it all the time, and I've mentioned this several other recent videos. I saw it in academia, right, where people, they didn't believe what they were professing, but they did it to get along, right? And that's exactly what the party did in communist Poland. And here he's talking about his friend and he gives them all kind of weird names, like this is Alpha the Moralist. And he says, in his desire to win approbation, he had simplified his picture to conform to the wishes of the party. One compromise leads to a second and a third, until at last, though everything one says may be perfectly logical, it no longer has anything in common with the flesh and blood of living people. And you see this, and I interestingly, because I'm intimately familiar with higher education and the hiring processes and the tenure process, you see that, and it's not really about scholarship necessarily. You don't have to be a really good scholar. In fact, to be a really good scholar, you invite disdain. But what it is it's about finding the right team. Their team building exercises in hiring and tenure practices. And then usually they're looking for people ideologically aligned with whatever the department happens to be. It's kind of interesting. And you would see this happen in Catholic colleges, for instance, which I have most experience in, where eventually they became, Catholic colleges became not really Catholic, except for in name only, because they, in their generosity of hiring practices to find diversity of viewpoints and so forth, what ended up happening is they diversity viewpointed themselves out of a job, and there were no more Catholics were no longer welcome, really. And instead you had just, the standard military issue, progressive, politically progressive professors, and pushing an agenda. And it happens like Milosz talks in this book, piece by piece. It doesn't happen all overnight. It happens gradually, where you compromise this part of your integrity, then another part of your integrity, and all of a sudden you have no integrity, and you have no college either. You see similar things also in seminary formation, where seminary formation also is about, it's conformity. You want to have people to conform to a certain ideology, which I understand, right? And because of that ideology has to be, it's so important, and I mean, you can almost excuse it in a church setting, because you do want, you know, somewhat of a uniformity. But do you want a uniformity of opinion in a college or university setting? And I would say no, you don't. You want plurality, you want pluralism, I would think, in a college or university setting, which we don't have. But also, and this is where it gets interesting, is the control of information that we see throughout the West, especially right now, which is kind of a weird thing, because for the Romanians I knew living under communism, the West and the United States in particular was like this bastion, it's this light on a hill that where you had free speech and you could criticize the government and not fear going to prison, which, as we've seen, it's not like that anymore. It's not quite like that anymore. So what do you do, right? What is the answer to living in this kind of totalitarian, even soft totalitarian nightmare, right? Again, and there are examples from the past, and the other book I want to talk about is this one right here, Vaclav Havel, Living in Truth, which is a collection of his essays. Now, Vaclav Havel, if you don't know, an interesting, he was a playwright. So here we have Milosz, who is a poet. Then we have Havel, who's a playwright. So two people from the arts, from literature, right? Who live in totalitarian countries. In fact, Milosz was not, but Havel was imprisoned for his outspokenness and his criticisms of the government, usually on bullshit charges, right? But eventually, Havel he was the first democratically elected president of the Czech Republic. So he was after communism fell, Czechoslovakia became the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Now he and his compatriots, and this is so inspiring to me. In fact, the first time I published a poem was in the journal Cross Currents. I don't even know if it's still around. It was kind of a Christian, I wouldn't say progressive, but Christian. It's certainly an intellectual Christian journal. They always published interesting things. I don't know if they're still in business, but the first time I was published, I published a poem in there, and it happened to have Vaclav Havel on the cover and an interview with him, and I was like, I have arrived. And this is before the fall of communism too, I think. No, it wasn't. No, it was not. It was right after the fall of communism. It might have been before he was elected, though. But in this book, he talks about how they've decided to finally live, and what they did is they said, well, screw this. After a while, we're just going to live how we want to live. And if they put us in jail, they put us in jail. But we'll make fun of them. We'll make the powers. We'll make fun of them. We'll have our own culture. They're trying to force this bogus culture on us. We're gonna maintain our own culture. So what he called that was parallel structure. Sometimes it's called the parallel polis, right? The parallel system. And this goes back to what I was talking earlier with Blade Runner and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, where there was this parallel structure that Philip K. Dick depicts there, which is kind of a mirror image of this, or a photo negative, because in Dick, it's the real structure, or the parallel structure is the bogus one, whereas we live in the culture where we are, it's the master structure is the bogus one, and the parallel structure, and they're out there, are the real ones. Now, one of the things he says here, I'm going to read a little quote for you. This is from his famous essay, The Power of the Powerless. You should read it. The profound crisis of human identity, brought on by living within a lie, A crisis which in turn makes such a life possible certainly possesses a moral dimension as well. It appears, among other things, as a deep moral crisis in society. A person who has been seduced by the consumer value system, whose identity is dissolved in an amalgam of the accoutrement of mass civilization, and who has no roots in the order of being, no sense of responsibility for anything higher than his or her own personal survival, is a demoralized, and he emphasizes that word, person. The system depends on this demoralization, deepens it, is in fact a projection of it into society. Now, what have we lived through in the last 5 years but a demoralization of society? And as I talked in one of the earlier videos last week or the week before, that's how propaganda works. Is I wouldn't say demoralize would be the one word, but you create this free floating anxiety, and you stress people out, and then you threaten them, and then they'll do anything. give me the shot, whatever. Just let me go on vacation or go to work or whatever, right? But that's demoralizing society. And what happened with the parallel structures? They said, well, screw this. You're not demoralizing me. You're not going to make me less than human. It's like that scene from The Elephant Man. I am a man, right? And then he's writing this under communism. And he talks about the post-totalitarian system is mounting a total assault on humans, and humans stand alone against it, abandoned and isolated. It is therefore entirely natural that all the dissident movements are explicitly defensive movements. They exist to defend human beings and the genuine aims of life against the aims of the system. And I would submit that that's what our moment has come. We're dissident movements. Like I'm certainly am, and that you're called to, as he puts it. I lost my page. There it is. They exist to defend human beings and the genuine aims of life against the aims of the system. I mean, aren't those inspiring words? Come on. You and I and everybody else, let's exist to defend human beings and the genuine aims of life against the aims of the system. Right? What are the aims of life? And what are the aims of the system? I think it's very simple. The aims of life are human flourishing, right? To have relationships with other people, to read good books, right? To talk about what's meaningful, to pursue meaning, to pursue happiness, right? But what are the aims of the system? The aims of the system are control and oppression, and I think what happens is, and I talked about systems, right? I talked about the system of higher education. It's like, I know how sausage is made. The system of the seminary system, right? What are the aims of those systems, right? What are the aims of the greater systems, meaning, governments, and the problem is when the governments get too big and too powerful. It's like the ring in Lord of the Rings. I have it. Might as well use it. I got all this power. Might as well use it. Let's tell Facebook to take that guy's account off or whatever, right? And so this is what we have now. When I started talking about this, I was talking about transhumanism, because the other thing that was interesting to me, and we'll probably wrap this up a little bit. The other thing that was interesting to me as far as transhumanism goes is just as the pandemic measures and the shutdowns and lockdowns and all that stuff were happening, there was also like a kind of media campaign promoting transhumanism. It's kind of not completely quiet, but it's kind of receded a little bit. I mean, you might remember, this is probably 2021, 2022. There were news stories about artificial wombs, for instance, and there were also, I mean, we saw this also, I think, with the rapid rise in the trans, phenomenon, right? Where and I my suspicion is that when you had all these kids locked down, having school on Zoom, stressed out, because I saw it with my own students how devastated and shell shocked they were for the whole time. Um, we feel, distance from our own bodies or distance from community, and I've seen this happen. And I would suggest, I don't know for sure, but I imagine one day someone's going to do some excavation of this in a scholarly way and go, wow, that's really contributed to this whole thing that happened. It's part of this entire phenomenon that happened, that is that is the post-COVID world. Nevertheless, you see and saw then that there were people, dissidents we can call them, and more power to you dissidents out there, who refused to participate in so many of the, and we could call them transhumanist projects, because if Mary Harrington, who argues, and I think argues well, that actually transhumanist era began with the introduction of the abortion, not the abortion, with the pill, right? Because it changed the human body, in this case the body of women, and treating their actually healthily working apparatus of monthly cycles and of fertility and egg removal, that treating that like a disease. So it changed what it was to be human. And actually, you probably know this, people who took birth control pills become attracted to different kinds of men, right? And then they get off the pill. They're like, wow, how'd I get with you? You don't appeal to me at all. And that's kind of that's early stage transhumanism. But I think the later stages are when you take that a couple steps further and start to incorporate, whether it's surgical procedures or hormone treatments or whatever it happens to be. This is escalating the scale of transhumanism. And of course, people like Noah Yuval Harari, who kind of an activist on behalf of a transhumanist society. And the thing is with transhumanism, and this is what you see in a way in Blade Runner, right? Or even with AI, I think that's really accelerated in this period. I said, what you see with these, and it becomes more and more difficult to distinguish what a human person is. There's that great scene, if you've seen My Dinner with Andre, where Andre Gregory is talking to Wallace Shawn, and he says, and we have to wonder, and this is 1981 when it came out, 1980. We have to wonder if such a thing as a human person will still be a thing in the future. And I think that's certainly where we're getting. I don't know. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but recently my son and I were remodeling our kitchen, and my son's a contractor. And when I took him out to dinner, and when we got done with one day we were working, and I just happened to, bring it up. I said, hey, how many people, your peers, your friends, how many would you say are on some kind of like antidepressant or antipsychotic or some kind of medication that they have to take all the time? And he didn't think long. He was, probably 2/3. No, probably 3/4. Which is amazing, right? When you hear about these things. Which also, I would submit, I'm sure there are cases where it's necessary, but I know this from having been a teacher, that one boy starts talking too much in class, and they put him on Ritalin immediately, or Adderall or something. So if you have this, what is happening to the human person inside of such a paradigm, right? What is happening, and is it okay? Now, these are the kinds of questions people don't necessarily ask, but I think they're important questions to ask because, and this is what philosophy is. If you're not asking, what does it mean to be human, and the related question, am I human? Am I still human? Has my consciousness been co-opted by whatever, through advertising, through media, through whatever? It's important questions, right? And I would say, the funny thing is, when I first wrote about transhumanism 25 years ago, or however long it was, started talking to students about it, and they just thought, Professor Martin, that ain't never going to happen. It's crazy. But it's happening. It's happening right now. But and for me, it's almost like with German Romanticism, right? German Romanticism was this little tiny group of basically kids, guys in their 20s, and their girlfriends and wives, who just kind of had this vision of a new way to do things, and they were rejecting the scientific paradigm of the Enlightenment, rejecting all that kind of totalitarianism that actually came in their lifetimes from Napoleon. They were rejecting that and trying to hold on to a picture of human flourishing that was, of course, connected to nature, but also connected to art and religion, right? And that's what they were doing. But I mean, just a tiny group of guys, right? So if you were to look on the, in the vast ocean of history, there's like a little bunch of guys who didn't really amount to much as a movement. But they did, because, face it, we're still talking about them. And the aims that they had, right? They existed, I would submit, to defend human beings and the genuine aims of life against the aim of the system. That's what the Romantics were doing, and that's what we're doing. That's what I'm doing. I mean, they're little things, and no one's going to thank you probably, but I think the greatest radical act is to live an authentic life, and that's defending the aims of life, right? And you can see this, in certain movements in the world, but they're not very popular. They don't hit the algorithms like some other things do. But nevertheless, you're going to find your people. You're going to find your people. For instance, where we live, our kind of network has to do with, and these are not people who would identify as dissidents, unless you might have to explain what dissident means. But there's a network of farmers and craftspeople out here in the countryside in Michigan, where I live, where, there's the emphasis is on not complete self-sustainability, but as much as possible. So we live on a farm, raising your own vegetables, your own meat, your own grain, and also exchanging with others. So, for instance, for a while, we used to have a cow, a dairy cow, but it got to be too much when my daughters got older. It was too much for just my wife and I to take care of. So we sold the cow, but another person bought a cow. And so we have this network with, we have the milk network, we have the vegetable network, we also have the practical skills network, like my sons are learning blacksmithing, and also learn tracking and other kinds of things. But there's also there's a kind of network related to the arts, right? To education in the arts. So I've talked about it before. There's the model of the Irish hedge school, which is another dissident movement, because the Irish did not want their kids learning English history, English totalitarianism, Protestant ascendancy. So they hired these clandestine teachers to teach their kids in barns. They called them hedgerows. They didn't really teach in hedgerows, but in barns or in secret churches where they learned Irish history and Irish language and Irish culture, in addition to Greek and Latin and whatever else happened, blacksmithing, whatever else they needed to know. So so there's hope. So there's hope. I'm a hopeful person, but we certainly are. I tell my friends, we're actually living in the new dark ages right now. But the thing is with the new dark ages, it anticipated the Renaissance or the original dark ages. They always anticipate a Renaissance. And in the dark ages, we could look at the European dark ages, so called. What that anticipated was what they called the little Renaissance of the 12th century, which is when Gothic architecture, praying the Rosary, the spirituality of Saint Francis of Assisi, of Hildegard of Bingen, which changed kind of changed culture and changed it. It became a less dark place, you know. And in fact, a great example is that is the movement from Romanesque to Gothic architecture, where the Romanesque, the churches were dark, the windows were small. You're thinking about sin. And then with Gothic, the windows become huge and filled with light and color. So it opens up the world. So it might be dark now, but there's darkness before dawn. Okay? And I'll talk to you next time. Stay sane, people. Stay sane.